Have you been what?
So
Sorry, can you repeat?
I'm trying to get my colleagues a bit more involved on these calls. So anything I can do to make them look more interesting would be good.
I have lots of ideas. Is what we're putting down there.
Yeah, I mean, I'm planning to spend a bit more this year working on my PhD than working on facility registry. So I've got to try to get other people involved.
Okay,
it's a good idea, I think, to start putting these things down. I can.
Yeah, what kind of things would they like to see, Bob? You think?
I don't know. Review website, I think, is a really interesting one. I think one of the things we really do need to work on, and this is a failing from our side, really, is that we've not really got much indication on the website of DHIS as a facility registry, which obviously we put quite a bit of work into. So it would be good to reflect that. Updating Fred API, that's obviously a hugely important thing. I think we're all really much wiser now as to what works and what doesn't work and what we need to do. So yeah, that's something that's getting the likes of Morton involved would be really important.
Do we want to break out the updating the Fred API piece into some of the kind of common sections that were coming up prior to when we started talking about OHIE? Like I know, some of the metadata stuff and supporting hierarchies and various other things were common topics that we saw as kind of next steps to update that.
I'll just write it down as for examples.
Yeah, you guys are probably better thinking from the hip. What are you writing down? Metadata version.
And there's like an infimum of little tweaks, like the operators for certain searches and things like that. But I think these are the important ones.
One thing that some of the other communities are doing that might be helpful, I think at some point maybe in the early days of the facility registry community we did this, but trying to firm up like our mission, vision, and goals of the community might be good. Like I've seen some of the other communities send around some first drafts of what theirs are, and I think I saw some early drafts from a year or two ago, but it might be good to maybe revisit that real quickly at some point.
I like that. Just to remind us why we're here.
We just typed implement ATNA. By implement ATNA, I presume this is the PKI stuff, is it?
Things. It has a PKI stuff between nodes, which is the node authentication part of NA, and then it has an audit trail, which is basically a vanilla flavored version of syslog protocols. But you have to put in some semantics in there to be able to do audits.
Right.
I mean, it's pretty. We have already the API for the activity, and this is just another format for that, essentially. So I think it would just be it may be interesting to some members to understand what ATNA looks like and how it could be implemented. But I'm just throwing it out there really as a seed, right? I'm not.
Yeah.
I'm trying to not self-censor into specific things or a roadmap with like either a technical or a political agenda. It's just like, here's some stuff I think folks might be interested in.
Yeah, I think the review and look at part is probably the most immediate for me anyway.
And
what's the difference between review and look at?
Well, and look at and ponder. I feel free to edit it. I was like learn about and ponder and like review and like show an implementation or something. Sorry, Paul. Go ahead.
Well, I guess just to frame what my feedback to you is this the roadmap for topics of discussion on the community calls, or is this a roadmap for what we want to accomplish as a community?
Right now, it was intended to be like a roadmap for what are the calls going to be about, right?
Sure.
And just that being a proxy for what we intend to accomplish. I think one of the things that happened is that when we were doing that like mission visionary stuff early on, like Scott was saying, sometimes you get good feedback, but sometimes also it's like people say like, I don't know, it's like, are we going to do the versioning API or not? So I think like this is kind of like at the middle level, it's more at the activity level, and hopefully it leads to results.
Right.
But it might be easier. I mean, one of the challenging messages that you're trying to convince people that you're not trying to convince people. You're trying to inform people to make good decisions about the use of your time, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't want to sell what isn't there in terms of people participating and the topics that will be discussed. And they might say, yeah, I want to show up for that hour if it's about this, or I want to look at this tool because I could learn from that. If it's more high-level goals, I think we can say like what we think are the high-level goals that lead to these activities, and of course ask feedback for that. But I think this is an easier thing to give feedback on.
Well, my sense is, unlike some of the other communities, and again, this is just my personal experience, there is a lot of very active work to basically implement facility registries in a number of countries. And I would presume that many of them have enough humility to recognize that they probably could stand to hear about how others are doing that. And I get a sense that there's some pent-up demand for that. Mm-hmm. So I think one dimension is just, making sure that those people are feeling like they have a place to get support, peer support. So, I think there's probably some more deliberate outreach that we could do with, for example, with Jorge from PEPFAR and some of the other guys that we know for a fact are doing active implementation work. The other important thread is that some of the presumptions of how a facility registry needs to behave in terms of how it communicates to other parts of the infrastructure, we've come to some conclusion that some of those need to change over time as well. So, like for example, reviewing and looking at ATNA implies that there might be an option where we wouldn't do that. But I think what we agreed to in the architecture meeting was that we were going to ultimately find some way to test this out. And if it doesn't work in a laboratory setting, then we would, consider alternatives. And so I think, expressing to people that the facility registry reference implementation work and some of the presumptions made about what the facility registry does and doesn't do are going to change. And you all probably, if you have a stake in making sure that it represents your intentions, that you're on these calls. So it seems like there's value in saying, the world is changing and it needs to change, in respect to what we've all agreed to do. And here are the windows of time where you can have some input into that.
Yeah, and I think that's the idea. I reworded it so that it's, I think, more reflective in the ATNA space about that. So, Scott, you can comment about the implementers support, kind of, and using that as a forum.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the one thing I would say, specifically with Jorge, is they have they wanted to set up separate calls with us, and I think Jorge would be really interested in jumping back into these forums specifically around improving the Fred API and some of those things, because I think he sees value. Specifically around the metadata part. But I think that kind of gets back to helping to show implementers, something that they're working on currently is like, hey, here's a forum where you can learn more about what others are doing, as well as inform, future activities and processes and how the community rallies around these things. So, but yeah, I guess that's what I would mention.
So, so Scott, I literally just got off of the OpenMRS community call, the developer community call, and one of the techniques that we've used quite successfully to do what you're talking about is allowing implementations to perhaps come and just give a quick or prospective implementations, or ones that are already going, to just give a quick overview of what they're doing and how that's gone so far. Kind of like a show and tell.
Yeah, and I think we'd love to do that with Jorge, with the UCC guys, with Rwanda and Tanzania, and whoever those next countries are with facility registries that might want to share as well. So.
And then I think in the milieu of being able to attract people with those kinds of opportunities, then while they're a captive audience, help them understand that some of the conventions that we're changing, you have an opportunity to give input and give us feedback on all the reasons why your real world experience would tell us why we're wrong in some of our presumptions.
Okay. Yeah. No, that sounds great, Paul.
It's worked real well for me. I don't know, Bob, if you've had a similar experience. I don't know how you all structure your DHIS community conversations, but show and tells are something that everyone's interested in.
Yeah, absolutely, Paul. I think one of the things that we probably should do with our facility registry community and community calls is to have a kind of geek barometer on that. Because sometimes the kind of things you want to show and tell and the kind of people you want to show and tell to is going to be different to others, particularly the level of technical detail versus a more implementer stuff.
Yeah.
I have sometimes got the impression, I think I've made a good number of these calls, I certainly haven't made all of them, but I've sometimes seen somebody has dialed in and kind of sat there in the corner. So obviously had a different expectation of what it was going to be about to what it was actually about. And it's usually because it's either not been technical enough, the discussion, or it's been too technical.
Right.
And I guess, as a community, we really do talk about the whole breadth.
Yeah. I agree, Bob, 100%, and I think that's one of the reasons, because we have all the back channel communications with the people who attend, right? And so when somebody says, it was really great to talk about my needs, but I really didn't understand what they were talking about once they started talking about, X-query actors, right? And so that means that the geek barometer went too much one way or the other versus. So I think actually having this would let us say 1, 2, 3 wrenches, how geeky each topic is, and then let people discuss them. When, for example, we're having people from Tanzania discuss their tool, is going to be a tool thing. We can assume it's going to be middle of the road in terms of geekiness because it's going to be technical people. On the other side, if it's somebody's RTI is coming to discuss implementation process and story and challenges and so on, we can assume it's more an implementation story that will probably not be about the technology itself. So the geekiness will be low. I think as long as we're kind of explicit to the community about how we're using their time and what they're jumping in, is going to be better. I think people just don't like surprises in that sense.
Yeah, no, I agree. I'm just sort of linking what Paul said to this, that we should really do these show and tell things, but present them with maybe the 1, 2, 3 wrench scale or something.
Yeah. We just had a presentation from a group in India called JSS, and they're presenting their active implementation of OpenMRS, and it drew about 30 people in. So, just as an example.
Paul, with OpenMRS, do you ever distinguish meetings between more folks on the implementation side that have one gear of technical knowledge with more the actual software programmers and standards folks who maybe would want a more in-depth technical conversation? Because I know we've kind of tinkered with that idea in the past, but haven't acted on it.
Yeah, it kind of depends on where you're at in the life cycle of the growth of a project. In the very early days, we simply had one call per week, and as the group grew and the demands of what people wanted to talk about kind of extended beyond, and then we started looking at what are the logical groupings, and we've kind of rejiggered those a number of times. So one of the real active areas of interest now is in just basic education, and so whereas before it was called an implementer's call, it's now called a university call, and there's literally more of a didactic kind of a training type feel to it, and people volunteer to give training on various tasks that are of interest to the community. Generally speaking, we've always tried to distinguish between developer-centric, which is kind of design of technology versus demonstrations of how technology actually work in real settings. So generally speaking, those who want to see how it work are less curious about what's underneath the hood. But the problem is that if you start chunking into a whole bunch of calls at this very early stage, then you run the risk of dividing when you have too thin of a number of people to divide with at this point. So I really like what Bob had to say about the people that quote unquote dialed in and were in the corner. And one strategy that we used on the OpenMRS side is just make a habit of saying up front, hey, you're new to this group. Can we give you a couple of minutes to introduce yourself and say why you made the time to come, and be willing to kind of adapt the agenda to give them a little taste of why they came, and be willing to be a little adaptive while you're young.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think that's how we initially had been trying to build the community, and I think we maybe veered away from that a little bit with focusing a lot on CSD. But I think our goal really through this process of a bit of road mapping and intentionality in our planning of meetings from now on will help try to rebuild that and just help people expect what they're going to talk about and what they can get out of a meeting and how technically it might be. And then once we're able to kind of get some additional momentum, maybe we break it off into separate calls or however.
I mean, the really hard reality, and we're all talking amongst friends here, is that community building actually has a cost and a time commitment that's associated with it that's non-trivial. And if you're all feeling kind of under the gun to deliver things like CSD, and you don't have a clear understanding of what the costs of that are before you commit to it, then it creates these problems from time to time. And I can tell you very early on the OpenMRS side, we had these little things come up from time to time too, where we kind of fell away from the thing that we tried to be. So I wouldn't be too hard on yourself. I think it's just kind of a early step that you all are in right now.
Yeah, definitely. And then I would think it would just be a huge success if we start getting some of the actual country implementers to dial in, because I think they have some really great experience and they haven't been particularly involved, at least lately. And so I think, I think we're heading in the right direction with trying to showcase some of their work and loop them in.
But Scott, it's probably very obvious to you, but a couple of the attributes that I've seen work really well for that are, one, you need to give those countries, you need to advertise that probably 2 or 3 weeks in advance, and you need to give the countries time to kind of make time for that. And it's a little bit difficult to say a couple of days before there's going to be this really compelling presentation, because I've gotten the feedback multiple times. Shit, why didn't you guys tell me about this before so I could appropriately plan for it? And it's difficult for them to make the time for it. So I think what you're doing in terms of road mapping is really important. So you could start reaching out now to UCC, you could start reaching out now to Jorge, you could start reaching out now to Kenya, for example, and get them all to kind of do a little show and tell. The other person I thought would be really good was the guy that has worked with Bob and the folks at Oslo and also helped write that WHO implementation document. It would be really helpful to get him to kind of do a quick talk about that process and where it's headed. Those kind of things I think are really relevant and I think are grist for technical conversations in the future.
Is that Jason Pickering you're talking about?
Yeah. I'm really impressed by him, Bob. I think he's a good guy.
Yeah, he's a good guy. Yeah, I know Jason well. He is a good guy.
He's someone that I think has a rich experience just in thinking about this, and probably everyone would benefit from having a better relationship with him. I know he's very busy, but I think if you present it to him the right way, my guess is that he would be quite interested in being a part.
Yeah, no, we've had a number of kind of ongoing email threads with him about our implementation guide and all kinds of stuff, and particularly with trying to collaborate with WHO, because I think he has strong connections there with that facility registry effort. So I think it's a great idea, Paul. Let's add that as a kind of roadmap item to potentially add for him to share about that WHO guidance and his experience as well.
The other again, I'm just brainstorming with you all here. One of the other things that maybe is kind of the worst kept secret in the world is that PEPFAR has kind of made a true kind of expectation of PEPFAR supported countries that they're going to move towards facility registries. And I just wonder whether the audience would benefit from hearing directly from the horse's mouth what the vision and kind of rationale behind that is, and just help people understand what's driving that. I think people might be interested in hearing from Mike or Jorge or whomever about that.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great idea. Well, I'll ask Mike what if he's interested in doing it himself or how he feels. But yeah, I think that would be great, particularly for a lot of like the both Ministry of Health and U.S. Gov stakeholders around the world that are going to be under the gun for that.
Bob, what do you think about a model in where there's this clear upfront understanding of distinctions between the different kinds of content that come on calls? So like, for example, one week is more kind of implementer focused and then the next week is more kind of developer centric, and see how that goes.
Yeah, I've been just sitting here thinking throughout this call. It's got to be one of two things, really. It's either got to be that, where we kind of demarcate calls, or we have to sort of divide up time within calls to say, well, the last 20 minutes of the call is going to be geek stuff.
Yeah.
It's got to be something like that, and maybe it doesn't make sense to be too prescriptive right now as to how that's going to go, because it may depend really on what's hot that week. But yeah, in principle, I think it's a good idea to alert people up front, and it might be as granular as to say, well, this call is a very geeky call, or this call is less so. Or it might be a matter of saying, at the beginning of a call, as Scott is outlining the agenda, to say, right, the first 40 minutes we're going to be talking about this stuff, the last 20 minutes we're going to be talking about that, so you can feel free to go if it doesn't interest you.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious how much, Bob, you mentioned kind of like the burning issue of the week. I think this is a challenge for us. Like, how much do we want to stick to our, whatever roadmap we kind of all agree on? And then, like break out that burning issue into separate calls moving forward? Or do we want this community call to actually be a place where people can bring their burning issues and really talk about them here?
I don't know, Scott. I mean, sometimes burning issues tend to arise not really by choice. I mean, we don't plan for them. They just kind of blaze in front of us. I'm trying to think of examples. I mean, there have been calls when I started out getting into the detail of interacting between DHIS and the facility registry in Rwanda. Right, suddenly there were a lot of quite detailed issues there which were quite useful to talk about on the call. There's some of the CSD stuff, I guess, has cut into our lives in a similar way. I don't know, from a time management point of view, it probably does make better sense to say, right, these are burning issues, we're going to discuss them in 3 weeks' time, but sometimes that's hard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's drawing that balance and requires flexibility, and the balance between being respectful of people who are showing up that might have not necessarily looked at the agenda but still want to learn and get some value out and give them a bit of time, and also respecting the people who are putting overall energy in the community and the overall goals that they have. This is so we have to call out what is a time to build that connection in the community and what is a time to work together and get results. And again, I'm confident that with I think that at most we've had like 12 people come up, and at most it's 1 or 2 people who we didn't expect showing up. So we can adapt to that pretty easily. I'm not too worried about that. It is good, I think, to be able to send to in advance, hey, we think that this is what's going to take most of the topic, but always leaving time for the unknown and for the community contributions is important. And well, the people who don't read or don't care, or don't get or don't read or don't care about the agenda anyways, doesn't mean that they don't have value. So we have to play that by ear. I don't think it's something you can over wrangle like your head about in advance. But I do like the idea, for example, of bring people who have certain affinity in. So, for example, if we say, look, we're going to do a showcase of the process of implementing in Tanzania, I think highlighting that to other implementers and suggesting to the people who are doing that, hey, if you have friends or people who are doing this sort of thing that they might want to enjoy doing this, or just showcase it to your coworkers, please invite them. and have the people who are working on specific areas like build out the network through their self-interest. I think that there's also something we have to do a bit better on when we're doing the implementation discussions.
Okay.
Okay. So are there any big area gaps that you see here? So I see like overall community management in the first, like the mission, vision, and the goals, and the communications about it. Then I see like some standards and interop sort of area. FRED API, looking at single sign-on and ATNA, CSD, etc. Then there's some implementation lessons, right? Looking at how things went, requirements, I think showcasing local development that people have done. It's also an important thing to call out. And then we go more into showcase of tools that talk with this, or potential ideas of tools that talk with this, and review of the implementation guide. Are there any big areas that you think are missing? To me, like the three bubbles of like overall community management, the technology evolution, and the implementations are kind of covered, but I wonder what you think.
The only thing, and I think you could easily argue that it's included in how you've reflected it, but perhaps just in a different way, is just giving some space for the community to say, we want to see this happen in the facility registry. So it's kind of like, open forum to express what's needed.
Mm-hmm. Okay. We'll write it down, and it might be like an ongoing periodic thing, like every so often, like just rechecking on this agenda on the gaps that people see. Yeah.
I added a couple more at the bottom. I was thinking one call that would just be great to have up on YouTube somewhere too is just where we explain the difference between an MFL, a facility list, and a facility registry. I think people get all kinds of tangled up on that, regardless of like how many conversations we have. I mean, it can't hurt to have that one. I think we might find some significant interest there. And then the other one I added to was just maybe a review of the facility registry and how it sits within the OHIE architecture as we're currently envisioning it. Might be helpful too.
Yeah, I think they're both good suggestions.
Bob, any other requests from you?
I'm just typing here a little bit on these sort of these demos. You've got demo of DHIS getting facilities via APIs. We actually don't have a working example of that happening. What we do have an example of happening is that case in Rwanda where we're doing effectively the reverse with DHIS feeding facilities into resource mapping. I mean, there are quite a few. Just wondering whether I want to demonstrate that.
Okay. I think it might be good to think about because I know that it is something that was emergent in the Rwanda section, and obviously, like you guys determine your own roadmap. But especially when we're talking about how these components fit in an architecture, what sort of data exchanges are kind of expectable, right? And also what we learned from the implementation in Rwanda. It might be good to even just say, hey, look, we have this thing and it's not production ready, but we needed to do it, and this is how we approached it, and so on. Because it's a question that we've gotten as well. So we're trying to look at like what are all the ecosystem of consumers and providers of facility data around, and like how information flows in and out of them for what actors and so on. So that was I think that was just a prominent example in people's mind.
I think that one of the biggest learnings for me from the Rwanda case goes back to, in fact, a very discussion with Paul. I think back in the days of FRED, but Paul, you had talked at that stage of a facility registry as being something which sat at the as one of these kind of well-oiled components within an HIE architecture where it worked at doing hundreds of thousands of transactions per second together with the shared health record and EMPI and all these things which I didn't actually understand at the time, all right, which I understand much, much better now. And I've come to realize, I think, that if the facility registry is mostly that, like something that's something that can give authoritative and rapid response, codes for facilities out, make enterprise wrappers around other local codes. It actually is quite easy to interact with. Where we have a bit of difficulty, I guess, is that we've actually got, if I think of ourselves and resource map, we've got two quite large applications, right, with lots of metadata. And where we've had difficulty in Rwanda hasn't been so much us getting facility codes from them or feeding facility codes to them, but it's all this other metadata, synchronizing that between the two. We've kind of drifted a little bit from this idea of a very lean and mean facility registry functionality.
Right.
I think that the requirements that that we've outlined for the facility registry actually, together are still a good representation of what that is, and I think we have to be careful not to reframe it like in the lean and mean and so on. Obviously, lean and mean is a characteristic of that's important, but it's not the defining characteristic. I mean, lean and mean just means it's well done, I guess. It's not crappy.
But I think it also means minimal metadata.
No, it doesn't. Actually, that's the exact point. That is, like, if you're looking at what is authoritative information around certain facilities, right, and what is the use cases in which you use that. Like, for example, having the services associated with the facilities is super critical if you're doing real-time referrals, right? It's super critical if you're doing kind of like crisis response, kind of routing of resources and stuff. So I think we have to be very, very careful not to take the optics of the HMIS only and the optics of the few use cases that we've had and equate that to the requirements that we've heard from the community at large.
So Ed, could I maybe take a stab at what I think I'm hearing from Bob?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so Bob and I had, I thought, really healthy conversations, and I think, in some ways I really appreciated Bob's skepticism at the time, because he always has a good thumb on real versus perceived, needs. And at the time I was explaining to Bob that in a well-oiled HIE, you have essentially a transactional validator that can serve all kinds of purposes, and I think that is the fundamental primary purpose of the facility registry. But I think the point you're making, the point that Bob has been making, and the point others have been making is that in order for you to have those data available for that transactional validation, you need stuff on top of it in order for it to be useful to the end users and in order for it to actually be this real live manifestation of reality for the environment. And so that's not to dissuade people or to distract them from the need for those kinds of rich application-like functionalities. I think what Bob might be getting at is that when we talk about a facility registry and we talk about the tools that support the behavior of people adding and removing data from it, that there might be a separation of concerns that might be just a useful convention to explain to people. Isn't that what you're getting at, Bob?
Yeah, pretty much. That's
and what you're talking
it's a
about.
different role of functionality, like it's a different kind of hat. I think it's very dangerous to say that the hat must be worn by a different head, so to speak.
Lean and mean, from Bob's perspective, is not some kind of is not a value judgment on the importance or lack of importance of management application functionality. I think what he's saying is that a very simple kernel that has CRUD-like operations, has the fundamental ability, just from all of our experiences, to work, at a much higher level of performance, versus and it has the distinct ability to be able to handle lots of transactions, as compared to something that is bundled with a bunch of functionality and serves in that capacity. You can divide and you can separate out the concerns by separating out some of the functions into units.
I think, Paul, by this stage, this suddenly sounds very 2012. I think by this stage, you understand that that's kind of how we've both discussed it in the community and also what the technology does, right?
Well, I think what I'm hearing from Bob, though, is that he's starting to appreciate the nuances of what we were describing, and perhaps he didn't fully appreciate them before. And so, so you can feel comfortable all day that you understood those conventions, and so can I. But the fact is, if the community doesn't understand them, then they're not understood. So I guess that's really, to me, an opportunity to reflect on that. We probably need to get the point across 10 or 20 times in order for it to actually stick.
Yeah, and I think with I mean, Bob specifically, you have a depth of experience, a background, and a position that gives you like a much deeper level into this dialogue. I mean, we're not trying to educate, some guy in, I don't know, WHO, India, about what is the role of the facility registry. It's the first time he's encountered the concept. I mean, we're in another level of discussion here, I think, between the four of us.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of
I mean, Ed, I'm really just reflecting, I guess, on the lessons of the summer. I'm actually trying to see what are the issues when you have a kind of fat facility registry, if you like, in the same country context as the HMIS. Right? I mean, that was the concrete situation we're dealing with, right? And one observation of mine has been that primarily what has made the most difficulty has been the fact that both of these applications were carrying quite a lot of metadata, which we haven't really to date, I think, nailed down. And I think it's one of our tasks for the year ahead. We haven't really nailed down how that metadata gets synchronized and exchanged between the two. I guess my point was, if the facility registry was a slimmer thing in terms of that transactional validator, as Paul has described it, then we wouldn't have had that issue. That issue wouldn't really have arisen.
Okay. There's other ways in which the issue could have been avoided.
Sorry?
There's other ways in which the issue could have been avoided.
Which is how?
Well, I mean, one of the things that we discussed but we never did do well was that whole thing of, as we just mentioned, like extracting data from that you needed from the facility registry or contributing back the information you needed from the facility registry. In a way, it was a pity. I mean, they started defining forms and data entering stuff that now isn't anywhere. So a little bit by these discussions, a lot of useful metadata to them that was not necessarily useful to the HMIS process kind of like got orphaned. And I mean, if we were able to get back to the original idea where some of the data in the facility registry gets contributed from the HIS and is like partial entities, right? And we changed the spec to allow that, right? I remember when we were working on that on Fred API, it was actually one of the high, priority topics for the first version. I think we could get back to that, and even if they don't want to contribute it back to the facility registry for X or Y reason, it doesn't need to mess up the HMIS thing. Maybe we need to grab like a virtual whiteboard and come up with some alternate discussions and then say, hey, look, here's the situation that would allow people having as much of their data in places where it will get used that respects the authority of where data gets contributed to. And if people are putting data into DHIS as a tool, it's a great source of authoritative data. And then here's the use cases by which it gets queried and so on. And just like whiteboard it out and like play a little bit with boxes and arrows. And then wonder if how can reality match to that?
Yeah, so maybe just to maybe say what you're saying in a little bit of a different way for Bob. did you? I know you're very busy, Bob, and so I don't know if you have the time to do this, but have you taken a little bit of a closer look into exactly how things went down in Tanzania?
No, yeah. I'm waiting for it to go live. People have asked me, and I have asked, to have a look at it. But I understand the curation and stuff is still going on, and so no, I haven't seen it.
Well, to me, the important part of what I was trying to get at, Bob, was less about the go live, which I think is literally pending, and it was more to kind of make you aware of the steps of the process that got them to this place. And I mean, just to second what I think Ed is trying to say, there was a very upfront, deliberate stakeholder process, completely independent of any technology. We didn't even talk about technology, in fact. We simply asked a group of stakeholders that represent leadership in clinical settings, represent various funding organizations, represent the accrediting bodies for facilities, those sorts of folks. And we said to them, when we talk about a facility and we define a facility, what does that actually mean to you? And we literally had them go through a deliberate process of saying, here are the attributes that we would use to define a facility in Tanzania. And then we formally published that as a data specification, or at least the Ministry of Health did. And I think, to second what Ed is saying, when you start from a technology-centric process of arriving at facilities, then we implicitly make presumptions about what data is, what defines a facility. Whereas, different stakeholders might have a couple of attributes that they want to hang on to it that would make it very relevant to their behaviors, and perhaps allow the process of curation to be a little bit more communal and perhaps more sustainable. And so, when the Tanzanians went through that process of defining those attributes, and we can share that documentation with you, and my guess is that most people didn't understand the importance of showing that pattern. But when we did that, we then said, well, if you were to have these data and you were to have them updated and available to you, and we can put that aside for a second in terms of how we're going to do that, how would you want to get access to those data, and what would you want to do with them? And they presented a big old list of use cases and user stories that were very specific to the individual, and we documented all of those as well. So it was very much kind of, we're building it to meet your needs. And some of those needs were simply, I need to get the information in and out because I need to build an application that takes advantage of those data. And that was published as well. And I think the point that maybe Ed is getting at here is that if you allow a country to, independent of technology, to just simply say, what does it mean to be a facility and what would you want to do with those data, then that creates a human process that allows people to buy into the idea of an authoritative source because they all believe it's their idea, and then they can see from the roadmap of what you've built in that facility registry that their needs are being explicitly met in this time frame, and so that didn't happen in Rwanda. That was a mistake of the circumstances. That was a mistake of our immaturity working with the country. It was an immaturity of the leadership of Rwanda to not ask for those sorts of things. They just kind of made a presumption that we could just start building a facility list. And I don't want to go through all of the nuances of why that didn't happen, but it's, suffice it to say it was very suboptimal. I think many of the new countries are looking at it fundamentally differently. I do think that your ideas of having a lean and mean, simple kind of a kernel of CRUD that is informed by end users' data specifications is fundamentally important. And I think Tanzania is a really good example of what you just said, because one very core functionality that has relevance to Tanzania that might not to Rwanda is this notion that people within the community can curate the content by being able to basically submit changes to the facilities locally and then have them validated by authorities at the central site, and so that the work is not done centrally. Most of it's done remotely, and most of the work centrally is just simply validating people's requests. And the only reason that functionality happened was because the Tanzanians asked for it. Does that make sense, Bob?
No, it does. I certainly followed your early requirements gathering exercise. You had that Etherpad thing. It was the first time I'd seen Etherpad.
I did it myself, so I'm close to it.
Yeah, no, I remember that. And Paul, look, I think it's going to be really interesting to see how that pans out. I think it was a very interesting exercise. I think a lot of the requirements and things which seem to have come out of that was interesting. I guess I've not been very closely involved with DHIS implementation in Tanzania, but if I was to have been, I would have thought that those were all requirements that probably should be taken seriously by the DHIS implementation.
They were there. The UDSM folks that represented the development for DHIS were present at the meeting.
They were all there.
Yeah. And so here's the funny thing, Bob. Prior to that meeting, no one had spent the time to even think about what it meant to be a facility. That's the whole point, right? That's kind of the fundamental idea behind architectural development, is that you have to kind of force people to really be specific and not make presumptions that a facility is just an ID and a name. It has potentially more things that hang on it.
Yeah, but even now, when we think we're getting better to understanding it, we occasionally get sideswiped. I know with doing some data exchange with the IRIS people, we suddenly realize that they've got a notion of kind of health offices where people work in, which are maybe quite a little bit different to what our idea of health posts and health centers and clinics and things. So yeah, I agree. You can't go with preconceived notions of what a facility is, and I think the Tanzanian exercise was really interesting in bringing those out.
Yeah, and so I talked to the DHIS developers during that meeting, and they were really good guys, actually. And I asked them the very specific question: Do you all have all of these attributes currently within DHIS? And they said, no, we have some, but we don't have all of them. And I think that was the circumstance for all the stakeholders. They all had some form of the information, but not all of it. And so the question then became, how do you coordinate all of that into a cohesive, authoritative source? And that's what
is the governance process around that data?
Exactly.
Figured out. Yeah. And I think in the U.S. is one of the places where I've seen it be the worst. Paul, I'm sure you see it with your health information exchange.
The disaster.
Yeah, you get things like a facility. It's state/city/building/radiology services/floor 2/front desk/reception. Which was the service? Which was the department?
I think Ireland we could probably still 58. We haven't even got postcodes. So
So we're turning to the end of the hour, and I don't want to end the discussion, but what I want to just clarify, first of all, like it's the four of us here, right? So we're having discussions at a different level than we would in a 100% open forum, and unfortunately we can drill down. And I think, Bob, I would like to work on with you is to continue to shine light into what is this elephant of a facility registry that people definitely have in their mind, but you have this perspective of the HMIS that is really powerful, because the HMIS kind of like forces them to have somewhat organized lists for the first time, even if it's just to get their funding back. So given it's one of those important forcing functions, continue to shed light into what does that mean for the data governance, for the data sources? What is the metadata that would make it be useful versus fat, right? I want to explore kind of like where those like sliders are with you, and help communicate back to the community in a consistent way. I think it will help DHIS as well.
Yeah, I think, Ed, there's a few things we have to work on this year, and when I say we, I'm hoping I can find other people to work on it rather than me. But it's become clear that we've got to do much better on this notion of partial updates, bidirectional, because it's obvious that there are bits of information on both sides which sometimes one system has a greater authority over than the other. But whichever way it might happen to be, the last thing we want is to do double entry.
Yeah.
And I think the other big thing we need to work on, and it kind of relates to that, is how do we meaningfully exchange the metadata, the layers, as you call them on your side, and the kind of structural metadata on our side. Perhaps there's a role for terminology server in there. I don't know. Maybe that's just another moving part for us to break ourselves on. But we need to solve issues around that. At the technical level, I think the year ahead, I could see those as being two big tasks.
Right. I agree. I just added some of the notes to that. Is there any other items that we can edit to reflect that?
I think the logical units of what a facility registry are, I think, is a very useful conversation to have. Whether you end up packaging those up into something that people download or whether they're, separate, to me is just, it's very useful to give phrases to boxes. I don't know. It's just, I'm being sympathetic to what I'm hearing from Bob.
Yep. No, I think that's a worthwhile exercise.
I mean, in the early stages, we talked about simply, CRUD API being a box and user management being another box, but I would suspect that there are more chunks than that.
Agree.
And I'm not saying make it overly complicated, but I think just helping people understand what we're talking about and having, in some cases, having a very high performance transaction validator as a distinct kind of a kernel as compared to the administrative interface. I think it's a very powerful paradigm to get across to people. That's my opinion.
Yep.
Because at least here in Indianapolis, in Indiana, where we have an exchange, the facility, the thing that's closest to the facility registry, gets millions of hits over the course of a month. And so, they're very simple kind of hits. They're, is this facility valid, or how does this code map to an authoritative enterprise ID for a facility? And it's, it's read and write and just the simple kind of CRUD operations around modifying the content of the facility record. So I would think that if you build something that can allow for that, it certainly boxes implementations into a corner over time. And the reality is, honestly, as long as, my real gut instinct is, if you've gotten the country to uniquely define what a facility is, and you've got an easy way to get information in and out of whatever technology you build, the country can move forward, because it's not like the facility registry is this deeply profound technology. It's a list with CRUD operations against it, right?
The tool has a lot of other nuances and requirements, but it's not rocket science. It's like information with permissions and hierarchies. What makes it well done is that when you can know that you can do all those things at the same time as having any arbitrary UI on top and making it work well as a service in an SOA sort of environment.
Yeah.
And making sure that the geo wonks can get their data out of it as well as the HMIS wonks can get their data out of it.
Then you've won. You've won.
Yeah, that's what we're all trying, I think, to get to. So,
yeah.
Well, Bob, one question. Well, there's some things that maybe we'd like to have you mull over about what you want to show from the DHIS perspective and kind of offer that. You're going to be asking the same out of people who have other tools that have touched the APIs, but let you frame what it is that you want to show and so on.
Yeah, I should have a chat with Morten, because we've done a couple of interesting things. One of the things we've done I guess a bit similar to your kind of architecture and resource mapper. DHIS increasingly has started to develop this idea of apps, right? So you have an app which basically provides a web interface to an underlying API, and we've taken, or Morten has taken our facility registry implementation and re-implemented that, right, as an app. I think we're hoping to get possibly Google Summer of Code students working some more on that. That may be something interesting for people to look at.
Yep. So I think we're on board with a similar kind of vision and strategy.
Yeah.
And, So
it's kind of the way
data in DHIS or etc. One of the things that I think then you guys will benefit from and is learning how the whole security aspect works. One of the things I And it's interesting, right? Because you're here, like, just saying, "Oh, I'm gonna do like this other facility registry, and I'm telling you how to do it better." But like the security aspect and OpenID and all that stuff has really helped us, like, have a suite of applications built by Instead and others that feels like a seamless thing. And if I were you, I would pay attention to that. And but I'm sharing like my inside knowledge here. I see Paul nodding, so I can open the kimono and tell you all the interesting stories about building like suites of like infrastructure and apps on the web if you want some other time.
Yeah, no, so I really need to try to get Morten onto these calls, but sometimes Morten's spending a lot of